Today it's time for the mid-season garden tour. My name is Kristen with Sheer Goodness. I'm a hobby farmer by night and a full-time healthcare worker by day. We're also going to learn some things today. I'm going to show you how to identify a failed versus a successful cross, when to do the crosses, and contributing factors for failed crosses. First, let's rewind back to July when I started doing my crosses. I just finished emasculating several of the F2 female blossoms, so now I need to get two different pollens. I need some green bell pollen as well as some Tlacolula yellow pollen. I want to do two different crosses. So let's start with some green bells. I have a bunch of green bells all in a row here. You can see that once again a deer came in and topped off all my plants, but there's nothing I can do about that. So we have plenty of specimens to pick from here. We're looking for the male blossoms that are releasing pollen right now. So I'm placing the vibration right on the anther cone. So that was a pretty good one there. There's some pollen there, but I would like more than that. So let's keep going for a few more. Applying the pollen to the female stigma of the F2 fuzzy red. Keep in mind that the style is very fragile, so we want to lightly drag that stigma through the pollen. If you're too aggressive, you will break the style. Ask me how I know. Some styles tend to be very long and thin, delicate, where more beefsteak types tend to be short and stocky. '51. It's a fuzzy F2 crossed with green bell male. So I had 5 of these blossoms that I did. So I'll make 5 of these tags and label all five of them. Next, I need some Tlacolula yellow pollen. So I do think this is part of the process that is a little slow for me, is locating the plants right now. It's not too bad doing the emasculation and pollen collection per se, but walking through my rows trying to find the specific plants that I need is kind of cumbersome. So at this point, you know, there's not much fruit. They're just flowering right now. So it's not like I can walk down the aisles and say, hey, that's the Tlacolula yellow looking at the fruit. There's really no fruit to look at this point. So my labeling system is, I'll zoom in and I'll show you. On my Florida weave twine, I affix wooden popsicle sticks, which I have drilled a hole through. And this is tied with the baler's twine, the same baler's twine that I used to do the Florida weave. So here's the label for the plant. Tlacolula yellow is the full name of this one. So that's how I can identify what this plant is. So I have 2 of them right here, and I need to get enough pollen for 1 cross. So again, we're searching for the male blossoms that are very open. The petals are open, and the anther cones are expressing the pollen. You can see here adequate pollen. So let's take this over to the maternal parent. By crossing this with Tlacolula yellow, that plant has extreme plant vigor. It's very robust, thick-stemmed, vigorous, and I like the shape of that one. That's why I'm choosing that one as the father. Great. 52. It is the fuzzy F2 mother, or female, crossed with Tlacolula yellow male. Because it is so delicate, I am choosing to put it on the larger stem and not the small stem. Voila. Here's an extra one I added to my list. This one is number 56, and I'm using Tlackalula Yellow Female, and I crossed it with Green Bell Male. I only have one of this here, so hopefully it goes. It's much easier working with the larger blossoms and larger stigmas, such as this one here. So that was pretty easy. It's not nearly as delicate. I think that would be an excellent cross, as I love both of those varieties. So looking at the emasculated blossom of the Blaze of Glory, and I pollinated this with large gobstopper, you can literally see the pollen granules on the tip of the stigma sometimes. It's a little bit easier on larger styles, but that's a good sign when you can literally see the pollen stuck to or affixed to the tip of the stigma. So that's fantastic. Here's a couple that I just did. So this is, the female here is number 33 F4. And I did a second one up here. About this variety is that this one is at F4. It's really hot, so I'm really sweaty out here. This one is at F4. It has fuzzy foliage and fuzzy fruit, so yes, two traits that I want. However, I'm really not that impressed with the fruit on this one. The flavor is just nothing to write home about. So I'm trying to improve the fruit on it while keeping the fuzzy fruit and the fuzzy foliage. So I'm crossing it with green bell pepper as the male. So I would like to get the square shape from that one, as that's one of my favorite traits. Semi-hollow would be even more perfect, and I would like to improve the flavor. This one that I emasculated here is Pink Furry Boar. So this is bred by Brad Gates, Wild Boar Farms, California. I'm choosing this one as the female. I've been selecting this one for several years. It performs well in my region, in my climate, in my soil. I've been selecting for plant vigor year after year. This one has gone through both drought and flooding, and I've continued to select for the survivors. I also like the fuzzy fruit. It does not have fuzzy foliage, however, and I would like that, but it does have fuzzy fruit. So I will be crossing this with my 35 Yellow Solid. That's one of my lines that is very early and has very good plant vigor as well, with a smooth texture. So I do think combining these traits could lead to something beneficial here. This last cross for the night is my F3 White Beefsteak as the maternal parent. And what I'm using for this one for the male parent is Sweet Aperitif. So this is kind of like crossing a Chihuahua with a Great Dane, right? The Sweet Aperitif is very, as the name suggests, sweet, very small cherry type tomato. And I'm crossing it with the mother plant here is my white F3. Basically, it's a white beefsteak that my husband liked last year. I'm not a real big beefsteak grower, but since Matt liked this one, I did take this one to F3. So it's a very large sized beefsteak type, white in color. So I'm crossing the large. I'm trying to get the Sweet Aperitif. I want to keep the flavor of Sweet Aperitif, but I want to up the size because I hate the size of that one. So if I got to have that flavor in a large package, hence crossing it with my F3 white, that's my goal with that one. Today is Sunday, July 5th. So yesterday I did my second day of tomato breeding, And luckily, I finished weaving in all 14 rows of my tomatoes just in time for the storms to roll in last night. So we had pretty high winds, so hence the plants did move sideways a bit, but the Florida weave really is quite effective. And we did get quite a bit of rain last night too, so it's very muddy out here. Despite that fact, I am going to plug forward here with the weeding today. It is extremely muddy. You can see that my mud boots are covered in mud. Kind of no point in even wearing gloves, it's just completely muddy here. What I'm doing is I'm going around the bases of the plant. So previously when it was drier, I went through with the tiller. So in between the rows here are pretty weed free. I have 5-foot spacing between rows. But what I'm doing right now is going on my hands and knees and just pulling the weeds along the base of the tomato plants where I can no longer get in with the tiller. And I'm just filling up a bucket here, a very muddy bucket, and I'm trying to just throw the weeds in the bucket to carry them out of here. I don't really want to throw them on the ground. So I just want to show you weeded versus unweeded. So on this side here, this is what I mean by the unweeded. So along the bases of the plants here, it's very full of weeds. Yes, it's easy to walk down the rows. The rows themselves are fine. It's just the base of the plants. Especially with these shorter tomatoes that aren't quite as tall, they almost disappear in the height of the weeds. Now, the bugs are so bad out here today. Now I'm going to show you the weeded side. So this side has been weeded. If you look down these rows, you can walk down here with me. You can nicely see it's all clear along the base of the plants here. And this is going to help too with blight prevention, not having all the foliage of the weeds on the ground, where it's just going to trap moisture. So we definitely have improved airflow now. Another thing is when I'm walking down the rows, especially at the end of the season when there's fruit on them, I want to be able to evaluate the fruits very easily. So I just want to wander down the rows and see the fruit easily without any weeds impeding my vision. Another thing I want to point out is the type of foliage. So we're going to get some examples here. I'm going to show you the wispy foliage versus the more thick foliage that I prefer, and am trying to breed for more of that. The first type of foliage here is this wispy foliage. You're going to typically see this with the elongated and paste type tomatoes. I like the paste tomatoes because they're very dry and they make an excellent sauce in my rubber tomato machine. So looking at this type of foliage, however, there's a lot of airflow and a lot more weeds can grow here. This one has been weeded, of course, but there are a lot more openings here. There's airflow, there's openings, the foliage is slender, narrow, and not as big. So weeds will fill in exponentially in this type of foliage. And I'm going to show you a different one in comparison. So this second example is a much more thick foliage of tomato. And the point I want to make here is the weeds do not grow as readily underneath this. So this is yet another reason why I love this type of foliage here. So you can see the nice thick large leaves here. Much larger compared to the wispy ones that I just showed you. This one is 32 F3 square, so this was Sweetheart Cherry crossed with Boxcar Willie. So it's getting that foliage from the Boxcar Willie parent. And then coming down the line here, I have some Chocolate Bells, which also have that similar foliage. Come in and look at this one closely here. Just look at that nice thick leaf structure there. So that's going to make a nice shade canopy underneath. Of course, this hasn't been weeded, so there are weeds here, but there's a lot less weeds here compared to the wispy, more open foliage. Once the tiller no longer fits in the rows, it's all manual labor from here on out. That is, until the plants get large enough to create a canopy. And of course, working with tomatoes results in tomato hands. as well as your arms and extremities being covered with yellow pollen. Next, we're going to collect some pollen from the sweet chocolate bell peppers. I've got my electric toothbrush and some nice dark lenses. Let's start with this blossom here. So now we're looking for blossoms that are open. Ooh, fantastic. I could see some pollen coming out there. There's a little bit right there, not a lot, but some. Back to the female blossom that we've emasculated. Plenty of pollen on the lens. We're just going to, just like the tomatoes, we're going to brush that pollen right onto the stigma. The stigma is the tip of the style, which will be receptive to the pollen. A little bit trickier with peppers because the style is so much shorter. It really doesn't protrude out much. Some tomatoes even have an exserted stigma, which stands out beyond the petals. Plenty of pollen on that. Fantastic. I want to mention some upgrades I've made to my breeding tool bag. Previously, I have used the wooden toothpicks for dissecting the blossoms. Now I have upgraded to a metal toothpick, which I found on Amazon. This is a game changer and well worth the few bucks. It's very inexpensive as well. You get a package of several of them. The purpose of this was the wooden ones, the ends would get rounded off, and I would really prefer something that stays sharp longer. And obviously the metal is going to be more rigid than the wooden ones. So total game changer. I'll have a link on Amazon if you would like to try that yourself. Another upgrade I did was removing the arms on the lenses. So I'm using dark sunglass lens to collect the pollen. Remove the arms on these and it is much easier to slide underneath the blossoms when you're working in tight quarters. I'm still using an electric toothbrush to collect the pollen, as well as the hot pink marking tape. And a small scissors as well for trimming the petals. Let's talk about when to do the tomato crosses. I live in Minnesota, which is USDA zones 3 and 4. So my plants in late June are starting to get blossoms a little bit. There's no fruit at that point, they are just starting to show blossoms. Then in early July, I'm getting ample quantity of blossoming happening. Still no fruit, but this is when the blossoms really pick up the pace. So this is when I prefer to do my crossing, is early July, basically 4th of July weekend. You want to have an ample quantity of blossoms to pick from. It's about the quantity. Also, we need it earlier in the season to allow the fruit time to mature or ripen. For example, if I decided to do a tomato cross on August 30th, I might not have enough time for that fruit to ripen for me to collect the seed, ferment the seed, and seed save that. Because we can get a pretty early frost here in Minnesota, so you're really playing Russian roulette. So the earlier you can get that cross, the more time you have to ensure maturity of the fruit. Then there's the issue of AM versus PM. When in doubt, I always like to mimic Mother Nature, so I prefer AM. Notice when the honeybees are flying around pollinating the blossoms, it's always just shortly after sunrise. Now, that is the ideal time. Realistically, that does not always work with people's work schedules. I'm one of them. I have successfully done crosses at 7 p.m. It can be done. So try not to stress out about it if that your work schedule doesn't allow for that. However, if you have the opportunity to choose shortly after sunrise. The next point I want to talk about is simply being able to walk down my rows. So this is a big one for me, as you can look behind me, and let me pan out a bit, you can see how dense my rows are, and this is August 10th today. On the 4th of July weekend, I did not have this lush of tomatoes in between my rows. I could still walk down here pretty readily. Now at this point, the tomatoes are very lush and have filled in, so it's a lot more difficult for me to walk down the rows to do the crosses. And it's also a little bit more difficult for me to read the tags. I have popsicle sticks tied with baler's twine on each plant, and that's how I can identify what that plant is. So as you can imagine right now, walking down these rows, it's pretty difficult to find the tags. So that's going to slow me down. So it was a lot more efficient for me to do the crosses a little bit earlier when they're just blossoming and not waiting this long. I want to mention 2 contributing factors that can cause your cross to fail. And let's be honest, it is rather disappointing to see that your cross did not take. So the main 2 things are heat and humidity, both of which I struggled with this year. So typically in Minnesota, in the month of July, which is when I'm doing the crosses, our average temperature would be the low 80s. This year, for pretty much the entire month of July, we were about 10 degrees above average, so in the low 90s, with a heat index of over 100 and high humidity. So really quite unusual for Minnesota. This was a challenge. High heat. High heat can basically dry up or desiccate the stigma. So the stigma will not be receptive to pollen. It's gonna fry your stigma. Secondly, the high humidity will impede pollen release. So you're gonna struggle to get pollen when it's highly humid outside. Now that was the contributing factor, I believe, mainly for me this year, humidity and pollen release. Also factor in that I'm doing a lot of my crosses in the evening after work. AM time would be ideal. We make it work. But those are just some challenges. I ended up doing about 34 crosses this year to date so far, and that's quite a few. So if you're able to increase your odds of success, try to pollinate and use a lot of blossoms. So up the quantity that you're doing to factor in some of these fails due to heat and humidity. Now it's August 10th. Let's get going with the mid-season garden tour. So here we have my lettuce. Now it's bolting right now because it's obviously the middle of summer, it's hot, and I did not keep up with harvesting this. So the leaves are still edible, but they are a little bit on the bitter side. But I've still been enjoying the lettuce. And let me tell you what, homegrown lettuce, I don't have to worry about certain parasites on the news right now. So that's a good thing. Yet another reason to grow your own food. Also behind me, I had pulled out my cilantro that had gone to seed here. So the cilantro is gone. And I actually planted some new cilantro seed right here. So that will be, hopefully, I'm not sure if it'll be ready in time for salsa. I did freeze some cilantro just in case as a backup plan. And here I have some basil. The lettuce leaf basil is my all-time favorite variety. I need to get in here and prune this really badly because this is obviously bolting and going to seed as well. Basil is pretty easy to prune and keep it going for an extended season. I do have a patch of basil in the big garden which I am allowing to go to seed on purpose, in which I will save those seeds. But this patch here is designated for eating and dehydrating. Then behind me here I've got the Mexican sour gherkins. They're looking great. Let's flip views. So this one was the first succession planting of gherkins, planted on May 15th, which is why they are farther along than the big garden. You can see the height of these gherkins is actually extending above and beyond. So I'm using chicken wire fencing. And I think this is 6 foot if I can recall right now. So you can see that these vines are actually going up and over that 6-foot chicken wire fencing, and they're starting to flow back down. The butterflies love hanging out in these raised beds. So the gherkins are looking good. They're just starting to form fruits. You can see here we've got honeybees pollinating right now. Fantastic. Always want to have pollinator-friendly gardens around here. I do not spray any chemicals. I am 100% organic here. So gherkins are looking great. Moving on, we've got my cucumbers. They are finally looking great and producing. I like growing my cucumbers up a fence. I grow the Japanese climbing cucumber. So naturally they are good at climbing. And by growing them up this fence, all this is simply a cattle panel angled at about 45 degrees. Steel T-posts are holding it up. And look how nice, I actually need to get busy picking some. Look how nice they are growing on the fencing. Fantastic. That one got a little too big. I do prefer my cucumbers picked a little bit on the smaller side and not letting them get so mature. Again, we have some nice overflow where the cucumber vines are flowing down onto my lawn. Hopping into here, on the other side of this cucumber garden, I have peppers. These are the Lesia peppers. And you can see some of the pink ribbons on here. This is where I performed some crosses. We might as well check this one while I'm here right now. So following the pink ribbon up, looks like it may be a success. You can see we have getting pretty good amounts of fruit set on the pepper plants. They have quite a bit of ripening to go. So this variety, being Lesia, will turn red. Fire engine red. Really like this variety for fresh eating. It's sweet, mild. You can literally just munch on it like eating an apple. It's fantastic. Here's another pink ribbon where I did a cross. Fantastic. And then this garden here, I still have the kale. I've been a bit behind, and obviously I have not done much crossing with that kale. Hi guys, we have an audience. The Shetland boys are watching me over here. So the kale's pretty mature. I have experienced some imported cabbage worm issues. That's a pretty common problem that I have here with the brassica type cole crops. And these were radishes and peas here, and I have now since planted radishes and cilantro in this bare spot. So we shall see how that germinates. Ideally, I would take this kale and freeze it. However, I really do not have freezer space right now for kale. So I'm just trying to use it fresh as best that I can. And this variety of kale is blue Scotch curled. One trick that I learned with the kale, so in the past I would start my kale ahead of time in the house under grow lights, then grow them in my greenhouse, then transplant them out into the garden. This year I decided to try direct sowing the kale in late April right outside in the garden, so direct sowing as an experiment. And I have to say that this went so much better. I'll never go back to starting them ahead again. They are frost hardy, and yes, we get frost, and I believe we even had even in late May, we were still having frost and freezes. I remember because I was using quite a bit of propane to heat my greenhouse, and this will survive that. So it worked for me in Minnesota to direct seed this in late April, basically as soon as you can work the soil. One thing that's nice is then the plants are bigger so much sooner. So by the time the imported cabbage worm arrives, these plants are stronger, bigger, and more robust. When I do the transplants, they're pretty small and weak. They're not hardened off very well, and those imported cabbage worms can really do a number on the kale. Now we're on the north side of my property at my north raised garden beds. So behind me here, I used to have the Wando shelling peas here. I have since harvested them and ripped them out. Retilled this up, and I wanted to replant. So I've planted some radish and cilantro and lettuce, basically. I'm pretty limited on what I can grow. In Minnesota, we don't really get a fall planting. We get one shot. We don't really get 2 shots at growing. So for my fall planting, I can do things that are 30 days or less, like radishes, but that's about it. Anything else that I plant is just going to get killed by frost. There's not enough time. But you can see here that I've got radishes going. Looks like they did germinate. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that the cilantro will grow. I really want that for my salsa the worst. And then behind me, what I did here is I transplanted these ground cherries. So the ground cherries, funny story with that is I had a bunch of volunteer ground cherries growing in my Lesia pepper bed. And me being how I am, I love volunteer plants. I never want to let them go. I always want to keep them all. Well, it was just crowding out the peppers. The ground cherries were making a total shade canopy and covering up the peppers. So they had to go. I just can't bear the thought of wasting a plant, God forbid. So I didn't want to throw them away. I wanted to transplant them somewhere. So I transplanted them here. When I did it, they looked near death. I mean, this was July. It was super hot, and very dry, no rain. They looked so wilted and sad, I thought they were going to die. I did not think they were going to make it, but I thought I'd give them a shot anyways. And now, look at that. Let's flip this around. Actually greened up. They did turn into a nice, healthy, dark green. So I will definitely have some ground cherries here. Also, they were very tall and leggy, competing with the peppers. But despite the legginess, they're getting new growth on the bottom. So they're bushing out. They're getting some new lateral growth. Great. I'm happy because I'm actually going to get some ground cherries this year since I did not do it. Moving on to this garden behind me. This one was also shelling peas, and I have since harvested them and ripped them out as well and replanted. I do have some asparagus. I'm not very well versed with asparagus. This is something that I bought a few years ago online, and we planted the asparagus. Are they called crowns? They were basically dormant roots that we planted. You plant them very deep and you have to wait. And we thought they weren't going to do anything. We moved on. Well, then we had some pop up here just this year. So yeah, so I'm just going to leave that be. We would like to have asparagus if we can get it to go. The next raised garden bed, again, this had some radishes in this one. So those were harvested, picked up, and replanted. And then, knowing me, I gotta have extra tomatoes everywhere. So these were just spare tomatoes, like my seconds that I had from the greenhouse. And I just had to find a random home for them. Yes, I'm known to have random plants everywhere on my farm. Underneath my mailbox, you might find a tomato, a pepper, and some random odd spot around here because I don't like wasting plants, and I like volunteers. Now we're in my big garden, so this is the in-ground garden in which I'm able to use tractors and bigger implements, which I much prefer over raised garden beds. So this is my squash patch, and it's not doing well this year. It's been a very challenging year for squash. I'll be inserting some pictures. I'm going to show you what I had this year. I had a lot of twin blossoms. So basically, and this was both the male and female. So remember, squash is monoecious. There's female and male blossoms separate. And what I noticed this year was twinning. So there would be 2 blossoms, both male and female, a little bit unique. Now, when I did a little research, I could see that this can be caused from environmental factors, stress, and genetics. Personally, I feel like it was probably environmental stress this year. The squash did not like the month of July. It was very hot and not much rain. So it was hot and dry. They were very stressed. And no, I really don't have time to come out here and water them. So it's do or die. Another issue here that we had a lot of squash bugs. So I believe we had squash bugs and squash vine borers. In fact, these squash bugs, I was able to identify their eggs as well as the adults as well. So for the squash, it's not looking good this year. I did do a squash cross. Unfortunately, they did not take. I did it earlier in the season as well. So early July, right, that prime time for me. And it's so time sensitive. What I did was I did it in the early morning hours before sunrise. That may be a contributing factor because I couldn't wait until after sunrise. So that also could be a factor. But I do think that that stress from the high heat and dry was the biggest, as shown in the twin blossoming. So I don't think we're going to have a lot of squash to eat this year, which kind of makes me sad because I eat a lot of squash. I grow Amish pie, and I've also done Blue Hubbard. So those two are the main ones that I've been selecting for over the years, Amish pie and Blue Hubbard. This year my intention was to do the Amish pie, and I wanted to cross it with Buttercup, actually, that I bought from Baker Creek. So a bush Buttercup. However, those crosses did not take. And unfortunately, I don't think I have enough time now to do any more crosses with that. I did notice since we've gotten rain recently that the squash has kind of perked up and the ends of the vines are doing healthy. Squash vines can form roots farther down along the vine. So if the base is not doing well, the tips of those vines can actually take off, which is what I'm seeing this year. So there are potential for new blossoms for me to cross with, but if I cross-pollinate them now in August, it's a real gamble if they're going to have time to mature. I've gone as late as Halloween, leaving my squash out, but when we get a hard freeze, you really need to get them harvested. So a little sad with the squash this year. Might not even have enough for eating, to be honest. Now let's move on to the next section here of peas. So the peas, that's a topic in and of itself here. Let me go ahead and pan out so you can see the whole area of peas. I grew a lot of Wando shelling peas this year. I think I'll do a separate video just on peas. I don't want to get too long-winded here. But needless to say, I'm not going to do peas again. I was disappointed. In a nutshell, I would say I had a poor ROI, poor return on investment. It took a lot of land for me to grow these peas to get just a very small amount of fruit. So I didn't really feel like it was worth it. Now, I did learn a lot of skills. I learned when to harvest the peas. This is shelling peas. And I learned how to shell them, and how to cook them fresh, and how to can them. So it's always good to learn new skills. I wouldn't say it was a waste of time, but I probably won't repeat the peas again. Let's move on to the next section of the garden. This is section 2 of tomatoes. Basically, it's my tomato seconds that I planted a little bit later, and they were smaller plants from the greenhouse. Considering that they were planted later, they still look pretty lush and big in size. Not too shabby. I do have some volunteer ground cherries that I left. Also here I see some pink ribbon, so let's go ahead and check that out. This is why I like using the hot pink marking tape. It's very easy to identify. So following that ribbon up, let's identify the cross, and we can see that this one here was a success. How can I tell the difference? Because the sepals are trimmed on this one. When the sepals are intact, that is not a cross that I made. So this one is a success. This is large gobstopper as the female, and I would have to untie this to see what the male is. I can also reference the number 65, and then go back to my typed up sheet that I have on the computer, and that'll tell me what 65 is. But I'm not going to untie this right now. So that's great. That was a successful cross. The large gobstopper, this is kind of a neat one. So the large gobstopper, Lucy's hanging out with me here. The large gobstopper is something I've selected for out here. It's just like the original gobstopper tomato, only larger in size. So same flavor, larger in size. And I like the larger size rather than having a small cherry. So that's kind of cool. I also have a coyote tomato, same thing. If you've ever tried the variety called coyote, I have a version of that that is larger. The typical coyote tomato is a currant type tomato, so very small, like marble sized. And the coyote I've selected for is a large cherry, so that's pretty cool too. Let's move on to peppers. So I have a patch of usually I'll do about 200 peppers out in the big garden. And these are all sweet chocolate, which is a sweet bell. And this was bred by another breeder. I really like this variety. It's great for us northern growers that have a short season as well. The sweet chocolate is fantastic for canning. So I intend to do a video this year on how to can peppers. Let's go ahead and flip the screen and take a closer look at these peppers. I just spent Saturday weeding these peppers, so they actually look pretty good right now. Something differently that I did this year is I'm using tomato cages. So the tomato cages have been successful in many ways. For one, it's helping prevent lodging. These pepper plants like to lodge when they get big and tall, and when we get heavy rain and the soil is wet, they are also more prone to lodging at that time as well. I have had to put some stakes in addition to the cages as they are getting heavier. I also like the cages for keeping my cats off of my pepper plants because they like to roll on them and crush them when they are first transplanted out. So it's been a success. Happy with the cages and some additional staking as well. I do have some random tomatoes planted in here. What happened was some of the peppers got damaged in the wind. I really didn't have any die from transplant shock, which was awesome. But sometimes the wind will snap my newly transplanted plants off and kill them. So when I have an open spot, I must fill it in with something. God forbid I can't have any empty spots or any empty real estate around here. What I did is I planted, I know one of these is a boxcar willy. That's one that I like to use a lot for breeding. So yep, random tomatoes filling in empty pepper spots. It will be filled with something around here. Real estate and soil is very precious. Now we have the celery patch. Now this is interesting. I chose this spot because it's the wettest spot in my garden. Normally I would have my peppers extending from that end all the way to the west here. But in the past my peppers would not do well in this low spot. It's just a lower, wetter spot of the garden. Celery likes moisture. So I intentionally planted that here. I find two different varieties this year. On the right hand side I have Utah Tall Improved. And then on the left I'll have to insert the name. It's in a different language, but it's a dwarfing celery that I got from Baker Creek. I don't see much difference in size, honestly. I mean, the Utah Tall Improved is maybe slightly taller, but it doesn't look that different to me right now. We'll see when we harvest. But it's looking pretty good right now. I planted them in a 9 to 10 inch grid. Granted, they were much smaller when we planted them out, so now it has filled in nicely and formed a really nice, dense canopy of celery, which I like because now they kind of suppress the weeds. It's very thick. I don't know what the exact number is here, but I'm guessing it's probably about 200 celery plants. They're very densely planted. That sounds like a lot. However, I use a lot of celery when I'm making my homemade barbecue sauce. In fact, last year I grew a bunch of celery at the grocery store still to accommodate how much barbecue sauce I made. If you want to learn how to make my homemade barbecue sauce and can it, it's awesome. I've got a video on that. Now this area is the cucumbers, and these cucumbers here are mostly for seed saving. So the one up by the house is the one that I'm going to pick and keep picked to keep the production flowing. This one is going to be allowed to seed save. So let me show you what that, let the cucumbers get very big and mature. Here's an example of a large cucumber. They will turn yellow and get very large. That will be used for seed saving, and I will be making a video on how to save cucumber seeds as well. Again, this variety is Japanese climbing, one that I've been selecting for several years as well, so it performs very well for me here. Next, let's move on to the tomatoes. So we saved the best for last. Again, this is my breeding patch if you watched my previous tour. So this section is my 300 tomatoes that are basically all breeding projects of mine. Near and dear to my heart. What a big difference compared to the early season tour. Before, you could easily walk through the rows, and now, not so much. I love the look of this. It's my tomato jungle. It's my happy place. So looking down the rows, ooh, here we've got some that are even starting to ripen. How exciting. So this one is number 36. It's an F3 this year. One of them that I'm very excited about. You can see that it's growing in a truss format. So cascading down in a truss, very pretty. And it will turn fire engine red. It's kind of got a square shape, which I really like. Me and my square tomatoes. Fantastic to see that already. You'll notice with the Florida weave this year that I'm getting some tipping on the fence posts. So my end rows are leaning in a bit. And because they've leaned inward, that has reduced some of the tension on the twine on the top, unfortunately. To remedy that, I can increase the amount of fence posts that I'm applying. So I usually do every 6 plants, I will apply a fence post. I think I might need to increase that next year. We have a heavy clay soil here, so it definitely holds a lot of moisture. Here are the Empress green beans that I planted. I put a single row along this end of my tomato patch. I really prefer picking the single rows versus doing double rows of beans. So they are looking good, and I have done a harvest of green beans. Again, I've got my second planting of Mexican sour gherkins. Because these were planted later, they are not quite reaching the top of the 6-foot fencing. But they're close. Some of them there are at the height. Naturally, we expect them to not be as far along because they were planted later. They are still looking great. I will have a video on Mexican sour gherkins soon. Here I have some mint. I love mint. I love to dehydrate it for tea. This one here is the chocolate mint, pineapple mint, and spearmint. Spearmint on the end. I find that mint is not that invasive for me. I think if you lived more in the south, it would be extremely invasive. This is not that invasive for me up in the north. In fact, it does not survive my winters, and I have to replant it every year. Unfortunately, this mound behind me, the zucchini has died. And they have succumbed to the squash bug, unfortunately, here. So I'm pretty sad about that. I had multiple zucchinis planted on this mound of dirt. And like I said previously, I had identified squash bug and evidence of squash vine borer as well. So unfortunately, I did have to remove those plants. They were dead. I've kept one here on the corner. I think that one might survive, so we're going to give that one a chance. Luckily, I do have some zucchini in the back where the winter squash are as well. However, that one's got quite a bit more shade. They were doing better up here. But I should still get some zucchini nonetheless. Here on the end of my garden, I have a volunteer tomatillo. And because this volunteer was actually in a good location, right on the end row of my tomatoes, I decided to keep it. And I actually weaved it up into the Florida weave and treated it just like a tomato. So we will have some tomatillos, which I kept. I like tomatillos. They're kind of cool. They're interesting to eat. They're different. The tomatillos here have heavy insect pressure, which is why I really quit starting them in my greenhouse. It wasn't worth it to me due to the heavy insect pressure. Here is a different vantage point, looking from the south towards the north of the tomato breeding section. I just love looking at this. This is a little slice of heaven for me. You look down those rows, to the right I can see my Minnesota icicle with that blue anthocyanin splashing on the shoulders. Those stick out pretty readily. I love looking down my rows and just seeing a sea of tomato foliage. Super, super thick. I love it. I do not practice pruning, as you can see. I will prune the lower branches when I'm first planting them, but that's it. So I allow my tomatoes to be indeterminate, lots of lateral branching, lots of fruit. Next, I'd like to take you through some of the rows, and let's look for some of the pink ribbons to check some of these crosses. Here's a successful cross. Following the ribbon up, we have a single fruit with trimmed sepals. Pretty easy to identify this one. Here's an example of how early you can identify a successful cross. This particular fruit, you can just barely see that the ovary has swollen. Just barely. The sepals are still very much encasing that fruit, but I can see enough that those sepals are trimmed, meaning I crossed that one. Here is another success. The fruit I'm pointing to right here. This is a large gobstopper female, with I believe the male was Olive. My Olive F3 tomato as the male parent. So that's an exciting cross. How to know when a cross fails. One example is the entire blossom will fall off and abort. You can see that this stem has absolutely nothing on it, meaning that the entire blossom has fallen off. Another sign is the stem will turn yellow. Here's an example of one that did not take from last weekend. Yellow stem, that will fall off and die. Here's one that I cannot yet tell if the cross took. Everything was trimmed off. I left one blossom. Clearly I can see that that is the one I crossed. However, I cannot yet see if the ovary is swollen on it. So it's too soon to tell. A good sign is that it has not turned yellow. If it turns yellow, it is going to likely fall off and abort. It is not going to take. This one is not turning yellow yet, so I still have high hopes for it and will patiently wait. Here's a fun one I just have to show you. So this one was an F3 white tomato. So one of mine. This is one that my husband liked that I talked about earlier. It's a white beefsteak. I crossed it with sweet aperitif. So my example was crossing a Great Dane with a Chihuahua. And that one took. Yay! So here is this one up close. F3 white female, crossed with sweet aperitif male. This is an example of a successful pepper cross. Looks like Lucy's taking a nap in my pepper plants. And let's look at some of the fruit. Some of the fruit does appear to be ripening. I really like this variety to be fully ripe. Even if it has a hint of green on it, I don't like to pick it. So this one I like to let hang on the vine until the very end. Right, Lucy? What do you have to say about that? Thanks for hanging out with me during the mid-season garden update. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And stay tuned because the month of September is my all-time busiest month on the farm. That's when all of the tomatoes are ripening, the peppers, the gherkins, and even my apple orchard. So be sure to subscribe to stay up to date. Being that it is August 10th, I should be wrapping up the crossing season for doing plant crosses. However, I know myself quite well. Who am I kidding? I'm likely going to keep doing crosses for some longer time yet. As my shirt says, never enough tomatoes.